The iron gates of St. Jude's Reformatory High didn't just feel like a physical boundary, they felt like a final sentence. They call this place the end of the line, a nickname earned through decades of housing the city's most discarded souls. As I stood outside that morning, clutching a leather briefcase that felt like a relic from another life, the air tasted of salt and cold exhaust. The building was a brutalist block of stained concrete, its windows reinforced with thick iron bars. Every morning, the metal detectors at the entrance provided a dissonant soundtrack, a series of high-pitched whines signaling another shift in the trenches. Inside, the overwhelming scent of industrial bleach failed to mask the deeper smells of damp plaster and years of neglect. I wasn't here by choice. Only months ago, I was a professor at a prestigious university. A single mistake, a public disgrace that stripped me of my credentials, had left me radioactive in the academic world. No one would hire me. St. Jude's was the only place that didn't care about my past, primarily because they were desperate. Yet, beneath the layer of necessity, a stubborn spark remained. I wanted to believe that no human being was truly beyond saving, and that even in this concrete wasteland, something meaningful could grow. I needed to prove that my life still had a purpose. Navigating the hallways felt like walking through a pressurized pipe. The students didn't run or shout. They loitered with a watchful stillness that was far more intimidating than outward aggression. I reached room 402, the most notorious classroom in the building. Rumors about this room circulated among the staff like ghost stories. I pushed the heavy door open, expecting chaos, but I was met with an unsettling, crushing silence. The 20 students inside didn't look up, yet I could feel their collective gaze following my every movement like a pack of wolves tracking a wounded animal. In the center of the room sat Leo. He was the gravity around which the entire room orbited. While the other students wore their defiance like armor, Leo wore his like a second skin. He was quiet, his eyes dark and observant, tracking the slight tremor in my hands as I set my materials on the podium. Before I could even introduce myself, Leo reached into his pocket. With a slow, deliberate movement, he placed a heavy, rusted hunting knife on his desk. He didn't point it at me. He simply let it sit there, a silent challenge to my authority and a test of my resolve. I felt the sweat prickle at the back of my neck, but I refused to look away. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. My eyes eventually drifted from Leo's cold stare to the back of the room, where a girl named Sarah sat hunched over a tattered notebook. She seemed to be trying to disappear into the shadows. As I paced the narrow aisles, I caught a glimpse of her page. It wasn't notes or math. It was a hauntingly detailed sketch of a small bird, its wings half spread, trapped behind thick, jagged bars. It was a silent cry for help, a sign of a hidden depth that the school's iron gates hadn't managed to crush. There was a soul in here worth fighting for. The first bell of the period rang, a harsh electric scream that vibrated through the floorboards. Usually a bell signals movement, but in room 402, no one budged. They were waiting for Leo's permission to exist. Leo leaned forward, the rusted metal of the knife catching the dim, flickering light. He whispered, his voice low enough that only I could hear, telling me that the last teacher who stood here left the building in an ambulance, clutching a broken spirit. He looked me dead in the eyes, a predatory grin ghosting across his face, and asked how I thought I would be leaving when my time was finally up. The weeks that followed were a grueling masterclass in psychological endurance. Every morning, I arrived at St. Jude's to find a new petty act of defiance. One day, it was all 4 car tires slashed in the gravel lot. The next, the blackboard was smeared with a foul, sticky substance that smelled of sulfur and decay. My lectures on literature and ethics were met with stone-faced silence or the synchronized tapping of pens that sounded like a ticking bomb. Yet I refused to quit. I stood at that podium, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I focused my remaining energy on Sarah. She was the only crack in the wall of hostility. I brought professional charcoal sticks and heavyweight paper from my personal collection, items too expensive for the school budget. During a quiet study period, I placed them on her desk without a word. Sarah didn't say thank you, but the transformation was immediate. The next day, the bird in her sketches had eyes that looked like they were searching for the horizon. This small victory did not go unnoticed. Leo watched from his seat, his eyes narrowing as he realized I was providing something he couldn't control. Hope. To Leo, hope threatened the fragile dynamic he had built on shared misery. But the students weren't the only predators stalking these halls. I was summoned to Principal Miller's office, a room that smelled of expensive tobacco and old secrets. Miller sat behind a mahogany desk that looked out of place in this crumbling building. He warned me to stop being a hero. He spoke about St. Jude's as a neutral zone, a place where local gangs could exist without friction as long as the status quo was maintained. Clearly, Miller was on their payroll, taking bribes to look the other way, while the school served as a staging ground. My attempts to teach were disrupting his profitable equilibrium. The atmosphere in room 402 turned from cold to volatile. Leo began to sense the shifting tide. He saw Sarah's new sketches, vibrant, dark, and full of life. And he saw them as a betrayal of the code. He needed her to remain a victim to justify his own role as a leader. The pressure was mounting, and I felt the weight of the entire institution pressing against my chest. Then, the trap was finally sprung. During a surprise inspection, a bag of illicit contraband was discovered, tucked behind the drawers of my desk. I looked at Miller's smug face and knew I had been framed. He wanted me out before I could expose the rot at the heart of his administration. A heavy sense of despair began to swallow me. I realized that the children weren't just fighting the world outside. They were being hunted by the very adults meant to protect them. The hopelessness of St. Jude's was a designed feature, not a flaw. My spirit started to fracture under the weight of it all. Then, the peace shattered. A roar erupted from the cafeteria, the sound of heavy chairs flipping and bodies colliding. It was too synchronized, too perfect to be an accident. As the few security guards scrambled toward the noise, I realized it was a diversion. I saw Leo's inner circle slipping away, headed toward the service stairs. Sarah wasn't in the cafeteria. She was being led toward the basement, the dark, forgotten bowels of the school where the cameras were both broken and useless. Suddenly, the fire alarm began its rhythmic, piercing scream, bathing the hallways in a strobe of emergency red light. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had two choices. I could follow the professional protocol, evacuate, and let Miller's plan finish me off, or I could break every rule I ever believed in to save her. I knew no help was coming. I turned away from the exit, my footsteps echoing as I raced toward the basement stairs alone. The air in the basement was thick with the smell of damp concrete and the thumping of the boiler. The red emergency lights cast shadows against the walls. I found them in the far corner, past the rows of rusted lockers. Sarah was backed against a chain-link fence, her eyes wide with terror. Leo stood before her, the heavy classroom knife gripped in his hand. His crew hovered like vultures, waiting for a signal to tear the world apart. I didn't rush in with my fists flying. Instead, I stopped 10 feet away and let the silence settle. I looked into Leo's eyes, ignoring the rusted blade. I spoke his full name, a sound he had rarely heard used with respect. I told him I finally knew why he acted like a predator. I spoke about the reports from his childhood and his father, the man who had spent years trying to mold him into a monster. For the first time, Leo's cold mask slipped. His hand trembled as I explained that he was currently doing exactly what Principal Miller wanted. Miller needed Leo to be a criminal to keep the gang bribes flowing. Leo was just a pawn in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. The tough exterior of the boys behind him began to crack as I laid out the truth. I pulled a thick envelope from my coat pocket, the documents I had managed to swipe from Miller's office before the fire alarm. It was the paper trail, bank statements, bribe logs, and the evidence of the frame-up against me. I offered it to Leo. I told him this was his way out, a chance to burn the corrupt system down without throwing his life away. I was the only adult who hadn't lied to him, and if he lowered that knife, we could actually change the ending. The tension was a wire stretched to the point of snapping. Leo looked at Sarah, then the envelope, then back at me. His breathing was ragged. With a sudden sharp motion, he drove the knife deep into a wooden crate and let go. The low hum of the vibrating metal signaled the end of his reign of terror. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were suddenly weary and human. He finally realized that survival didn't always mean being the most dangerous person in the room. Tactical boots soon echoed on the stairs, but the flashlights didn't pin me to the wall. Because of the evidence Leo and I had secured, the police weren't there for the disgraced professor. They were there for the man in the mahogany office. I watched through the grime-streaked windows as Principal Miller was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking pathetic under the harsh glare of the sirens. He looked back at me with a silent snarl of betrayal, but I simply turned my back on his shadow. St. Jude's didn't turn into a paradise overnight. The metal detectors still buzzed, and the food was still gray. But inside room 402, something fundamental had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer predatory. It was protective. On the final day of the semester, I sat at my desk, feeling the deep ache of a long year in my bones. Sarah walked by and left a finished charcoal drawing. The bird was there, but the iron bars were gone. It was soaring high above the school building, catching a light that didn't exist in the basement. I hadn't just taught them algebra or literature. I had taught them that they were visible. I had taught them that they existed in a world that wanted them to be ghosts. As I walked out of the heavy iron gates for the last time, I saw a familiar figure leaning against the brick wall. Leo was there, hands in his pockets watching the sunset. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply gave a short, sharp nod, a silent pact of mutual respect between two survivors of the end of the line. I walked to my car, the sound of the gates closing behind me no longer sounding like a prison, but like a beginning.